Hello again, everyone. In this video lesson, we'll talk about causes of inflation. What factors, what events cause a persistent increase in prices. Generally, there are two main explanations of the reasons for inflation: long run and short run. If you focus on the long run explanation of inflation, why inflation takes place in the long run, why prices keep increasing, you should pay attention to the statement by the Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize winner, the founder of the monetarist school of economic thought, who stated that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So according to Milton Friedman, in the long run, the main reason for inflation is monetary excess. It's excessive printing of money, excessive money supply. If you don't print too much money, money will not lose its value. There will be no inflation. Money will remain valuable, and prices will not go up. So according to Milton Friedman, according to monetary school, the rate of inflation, this letter pi, which can be calculated as a percentage increase in price level, can also be calculated as the difference between money supply growth rate, this change in money supply from one year to another year in percentage terms, and the rate of economic growth, change in real output. Strictly speaking, when your economy is growing, you do need to print some amount of money. You do need to provide additional liquidity, additional money supply to facilitate this growth. Because when your economy is growing, you produce more output, there are more transactions taking place in the economy, the amount of deals in the economy is higher, and you need more money to serve these transactions. So strictly speaking, some printing of money is necessary. If your economy is growing, let's say at 3% per year, you do need to provide 3% of additional liquidity. You do need to increase your money supply by 3% per year. However, any money supply growth in excess of this rate will lead to inflation. To give you an example, it's very simple. Inflation rate in percentage terms is simply equal to the difference between money supply growth in percentage terms and the rate of economic growth, which we've covered previously in the previous week. The rate of economic growth, the growth of real GDP. So, for example, if your economic growth is 2% per year, however, you print 10% more money every single year, money supply growth is 10%, then, of course, this will lead to 8% inflation in the long run. Very simple. If you don't want to have inflation, don't print too much money. However, this is a long-run explanation of inflation. In the short run, there are some additional explanations. This includes demand pull and cost push inflation, combination of the above, and also expectations. Expectations play an important role. Strictly speaking, if you expect inflation to be very high, it will be very high. If consumers and suppliers expect that prices will grow in the future, they will incorporate this higher expected inflation into their decisions, into the contracts which they sign, and as a result, this will be self-fulfilling. These expectations will lead to higher inflation simply because new contracts which they will sign, new job contracts, new contracts to supply materials, new purchasing orders will include higher prices, so general price will increase. In other words, inflation expectations are self-fulfilling, which also implies that if you want to tackle inflation as a government, as a policymaker, you need to influence expectations. You'll need to announce some credible policy which will reduce inflation expectations. This will help you to tackle inflation overall, the actual observed inflation. But this is beyond your syllabus. This is what economics students on economics programs will study in the next year at level 5 in macroeconomics course. But for your syllabus, for this particular module, you need to know short-run causes of inflation, demand pull and cost push inflation, which we will discuss now. So demand pull inflation is simply the inflation which is caused by persistent increase in aggregate demand within our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So let's have a look at this diagram. We have our national output, our total output produced GDP along horizontal axis, price level, which reflects the growth in prices, our inflation. Along vertical axis, we have aggregate supply and aggregate demand. If aggregate demand shifts upwards, if aggregate demand keeps rising, this will lead to a movement in equilibrium from this point to that point, which will lead to higher national output, but most importantly, this will lead to higher price level. In other words, when aggregate demand increases in the economy, this will lead to acceleration of inflation. When aggregate demand is strong, firms will respond by increasing their prices. They will pass some of this additional pressure onto consumers. They will partially expand output, national GDP will increase, but when demand is strong, they can afford to charge higher prices. So this will lead to increase in the general price level. And usually, economies experience demand pull inflation during the boom periods in the business cycle. When the economy is booming, it's growing, it tends to overheat. And this is what we've covered in one of the previous lectures. So if we have a look at our slides for national output, for stages in the business cycle, this is the slide which we've had previously. Let me just reduce the zoom slightly. So generally, this is what I've explained in one of the previous lectures. During the boom stage of the business cycle, the economy is growing quickly, output is high, unemployment is low because we do need lots of workers to produce high output. However, we experience high inflation, exactly for this reason, due to very high aggregate demand. Apart from aggregate demand, in the short run, the country can suffer from so-called cost-push inflation, which is inflation caused by persistent rise in costs, which shift aggregate supply curve upwards as well. When costs of production go up, for example, because trade unions push for higher wages, or because we suffer from some external supply shocks, oil prices or other commodity prices in international markets go up, or we experience bad harvest, or for whatever reasons, for any sort of supply factor which increases cost of production and affects our economy, aggregate supply curve will shift upwards. And as a result, our equilibrium will also move from this point towards a higher point, which will lead to contraction in national output and increase in prices. When supply is scarce, every product which remains, every unit of output which remains on the market will become more valuable. So prices will increase and the country will experience inflation. Firms respond to this increase in costs by raising their prices and passing the extra costs on to consumers, and partially by cutting on their output because their costs are high. It's not as profitable as before. Some firms can go bankrupt or decide to move their business to some other areas and so on. So national output will be lower, but prices will be higher. So generally, the effect on output and employment will be the opposite to demand pull inflation. When we experienced increase in demand, national output increased. But when we suffer from supply side shocks, it's always negative for the economy because our economy is not booming like in the previous example. We do suffer from high inflation, but also from contraction in GDP, from lower output and increase in unemployment. The serious problem happens when both demand pull and cost push inflation happen or occur together. This is the serious reason because we'll have the effect on inflation which is twice as strong. Let me just draw a graph for you. So if this is our national output and this is our price level, we have some initial aggregate demand, starting position, some initial aggregate supply, some initial equilibrium, initial level of output, initial price level, and then we suffer from demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation. This pushes our equilibrium to point E1, which will increase our output and increase price level. So this is our demand pull part of inflation. And then we suffer from cost push inflation as well, which is a shift in aggregate supply curve. So this is supply side effect or supply side shock, which increases cost of production for our suppliers. And as a result, our economy shifts further from point E1 to point E2, which will reduce our output. We don't know where we will end up, whether our output will drop back to original output level Y0, will it remain slightly higher or will it drop even lower than Y0? We don't know this. What we know, however, is that price level will definitely go up and we will end up at much higher price level. And this increase in inflation shown in green is the cost push inflation. So when these factors occur at the same time, when we experience booming economy, but then a supply side shock, this will lead to considerably higher inflation. And then government will have a serious problem to tackle. And in the next lesson, in the next video lesson, we'll discuss the policies which the government can implement, government and central banks, in order to tackle inflation.